Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students of VIII, Assalamu alaikum. I am your teacher Muhammad Ilyas, and this is our ninth interaction regarding biology for Cambridge. Dear students, today's topic is the circle of life, and this is from your book Analyst Science Workbook 2, page number 94 to 98, and the chapter number 21. Dear students, our objectives are as follows. We will be able to understand the concept of the circle of life, and we will be able to solve the questions given in your workbook by focusing on the concept of the food chain, food web, and the energy transfer in the food chain. Secondly, we will focus on the food pyramids, its types, and importance of the decomposers. Thirdly, the role of carbon cycle in balancing the ecosystem. So we are going to start with the food producers. These are mostly the green plants, as you know, and the green plants has this ability to produce their own food, and they also provide the food to the rest of the organisms in the food chain. Because they have the chlorophyll, they consume the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they trap the sunlight with the help of the chlorophyll, and they do the process of photosynthesis and make the food. They convert the carbon dioxide of the atmosphere into a very useful product like glucose or starch. So this is how the food producers are helping us. And the organisms which depend on these producers, they are called the consumers. All the animals get their food by eating plants, and other animals, because they can't make their own food, they are called the consumers. They consume other living things. As you can see in this pyramid, the producers, and then the primary consumers, and then the secondary consumers, and you can also see the decomposers. We will inshallah discuss all these levels step by inshallah, and we are going to start from the primary consumers. Primary consumers are basically called the herbivores because it feeds directly on the plants. All the organisms which feed on directly on the plants, they are called the herbivores. And primary consumers are heterotrophs because they feed on producers. And since producers are called the autotrophs, basically these are the typical plants. Primary consumers are herbivores. Secondary consumers feed on the primary consumers. They are also called the carnivores. The secondary consumers, an animal that feeds on primary consumers and is called the secondary consumers, and a carnivore is the secondary consumer. As you can see in this pictorial representation, that the producers and the animals which are feeding on these producers, which are going to get the food from the producers, they are called the primary consumers. And the animals which are going to get the food from the primary consumers, they directly feeds on the primary consumer, they are called secondary consumers. Dear students, now we are focusing on the food chain. A food chain describes how one organism feeds on another. And this is the you can see the food relationships among the organisms in an ecosystem. The food relationship among the organisms is called the food chain, and every plant and animal in the food chain is called a link. Each food chain can have one or more links, as you can see in this diagram. Dear students, most food chains start with the green plants. The green plants are called the food producers because they make their own food. They provide food for the rest of the organisms in the food chain. Animals get their food by eating plants or other animals because they can't make their own food. They are called the consumers. They consume other living things, as we have discussed earlier. Now we are focusing on the food web. If we trace every food chain in an ecosystem, we will be able to find out a lot of interconnected food chains. And this is because many animals eat more than one type of food. Likewise, each animal or plant can be eaten by different animals. This results in the formation of a network of interconnected food chains, which is called a food web. As you can see from this pictorial representation, there are so many organisms which are interconnected with each other, and they are showing a lot of food links, as you can see in this pictorial representation. Dear students, a simplified representation of one of the many food webs in the sea, which is a saltwater ecosystem. Most of the food chains in the sea start with plant plankton, which are microscopic plants that live in the surface water where there is plenty of sunlight. The plant plankton use light from the sun to make their own food by photosynthesis, and they are then eaten by tiny animals in the water, and they called the animal plankton. Small fish and animals such as shrimps, crabs, and whales eat plankton. The bigger fish eat the smaller fish. Seabirds and sea mammals feed on a variety of fish. Most food webs are hung delicately in their balance. This is because any just a small change in one link in a food chain can upset the balance of the entire food web. Dear students, over here I would like to discuss one more thing, the energy transferred in the food chain. Living things other than the green plants obtain their energy from the food they eat. As you can see, a food chain shows how energy in the form of food is transferred from one organism to another. For example, when an animal eats plant, some of the plant will be digested and absorbed into its body. Some will not be digested but will be passed out of its body as feces. Dear students, not all the digested plant will be converted to chemical energy stored in the animal body. Some will be converted into heat, which will be lost to the surroundings. Some will be converted into other forms of energy, which will be used for the animal's activities. The total amount of energy that ends up being stored in the animal's body will be much less than the total chemical energy that was originally stored in the plant. So, at every link in a food chain, energy is lost to the surroundings as heat and other forms of energy. The amount of energy reaching the end of the food chain is only a small fraction of the amount of energy at the beginning. In other words, the amount of energy transferred decreases along a food chain. So this is how we can understand the importance of the food chain and the food web. Dear students, now we are focusing on the food pyramids. Food pyramid shows pyramids show the decrease in the number in the biomass from one link to another along the food chain. Pyramid of biomass, you can see the pyramids, the producers, and then the primary consumers are herbivores, then secondary consumers are the carnivores, and then the tertiary consumers. You can see the numbers of the organisms are decreasing from bottom to top. Dear students, if you are able to count the number of leaves, caterpillars, and the birds living in their habitat, you will find that the number of is much higher than the number of caterpillars, which is higher than the number of birds. The number of different links in a food chain can be shown by using a pyramids of numbers. The number of organisms decreases along a food chain, as you can see in this diagram, and this is because the amount of energy transferred decreases along a food chain. The pyramids of numbers for some food chains has an odd shape because the primary consumers are much larger in number than the producers. The pyramid of numbers often does not give an accurate picture of how much food is eaten at each level of food chain. So obtain more accurate information about a food chain, we have to draw the pyramid of biomass instead of the numbers. Biomass is the mass of living matter. A pyramid of biomass shows the mass of living matter at each level of the food chain, and the area of each box in the pyramid of biomass represent the amount of biomass of each link in the food chain. So this is how we can understand the food pyramids. Here are some examples of food pyramids of numbers. You can see how we can draw the pyramids to represent the number of organisms at each level. Now, dear students, we are going to focus on the decomposers. Life in an ecosystem does not end when plants and animals die. In fact, the food chain continues with the remains of the dead plants and animals serving as food for another important class of organisms living in the same ecosystem, and they are called the decomposers. Dear students, scavengers, fungi, and bacteria are some examples of the decomposers. Scavengers feed on dead plants and animals and break them down into smaller fragments, like the vultures, hyenas, crows, earthworms, crickets, and ants are some examples of scavengers. Decomposers play an important role in the carbon and nitrogen cycles, and they release the nutrients trapped in the bodies of the dead organisms so that these nutrients can be recycled. So in this how the decomposers are playing very important role in the whole ecosystem, and they are providing the producers with the nutrients so that they can produce the food again. After having this understanding, now we are focusing on the very important part of this chapter, and that is the carbon cycle. Dear students, all living organisms contain the element carbon. Carbon makes up the carbohydrates, proteins, and fats in the tissues of the living things. In our ecosystem, carbon in the form of carbon dioxide circulates from the environment into the bodies of all living organisms and then back to the environment again. This circulation of carbon is known as the carbon cycle. Some processes remove carbon dioxide from the air, while the other processes return the carbon dioxide to the air so that the amount of carbon in the ecosystem remains constant. As you can see in this diagrammatic representation of the carbon cycle, plants use carbon dioxide from the air when they photosynthesize. They convert the carbon atoms in the gaseous carbon dioxide into sugars and starch, which are carbohydrates. During the day, plants use more carbon dioxide in photosynthesis compared with the amount of carbon dioxide they produce in respiration. So in the daytime, plants take in carbon dioxide from the air. At the night, they give out carbon dioxide. Dear student, while the animals in decomposers respire carbon dioxide, a waste product of respiration, and is released from their food into the air. Some decomposers cause partial decay to the organic remains of the dead plants and tiny sea creatures, which form fossil fuels. When fossil fuels or other organic fuels burn, the carbon or carbon compounds in them react with oxygen to produce huge amount of carbon dioxide, and in this how this carbon dioxide is going back into the atmosphere. For example, the motor vehicles, they run on petrol and emit a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Dear students, beside this carbon dioxide nitrogen cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle is also playing very important role in transferring the nutrients from the dead bodies of plants and animals to the nutrients nitrates, and then these nutrients are consumed by the food producers. This is how the nitrogen circulates in the atmosphere. These two cycles are playing very important role in balancing the ecosystem. Like all other natural cycles, carbon and nitrogen cycles help to maintain the balance of an ecosystem. The carbon and nitrogen cycles ensure that the carbon and nitrogen compounds are always present in the ecosystem. The carbon and nitrogen cycles also maintain the relatively steady level of the carbon and nitrogen compounds in an ecosystem. And this is important because carbon and nitrogen are the raw materials for making carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, which are used for building body tissues. The carbon and nitrogen cycles thus ensure that life in an ecosystem continues. So dear students, after having this understanding, now I have selected some homework for you. You have to do all the questions of section A, B, and C of your workbook, chapter number 21, and these questions are present on page number 94 to 98. Dear students, you have to solve all these questions and then send the to your respective groups for evaluation. And I have selected some words for you as a spelling test. You have to memorize the spelling of these words and then send to your respective groups for checking. And the words are herbivores, decreases, surroundings, respiration, substances, decomposers, population, community, food pyramids, transferred. These words are for the spelling test. You have to memorize these words, and this is a test for you. I have selected the two questions for your test. The question number 1, what is a food pyramid, and describe the features of a food pyramid. And this question number 2, what is a decomposer? Give 2 examples of the decomposers. Dear students, you have to write the answers of these questions and your test notebooks and then send to your respective groups for evaluation. Thank you very much for being with me. And one more request, please stay at home, stay safe. Allah Hafiz.